Well, we're in this wee series on the book of Nehemiah that we're calling Lord Change Me, because God is in the transformation business. 2 Corinthians 5:17 says, if anyone is in Christ, he or she is a new creature, a new creation. The old is gone, the new has come. So anybody who is a Christian, who is in Christ, is changing into a new person. And the changing doesn't end until we get to heaven. 2 Corinthians 3:18 says, and we all with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into His image from one degree of glory to another until we get to heaven. And it's God who does the changing, not us. The last part of that verse says, for this comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. The Old Testament revival verse says exactly the same thing in 2 Corinthians 7:14. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face. So there it is, when you seek and find God's face in prayer, that's when the spontaneous combustion of change happens. And then it goes on, then they will turn from their wicked ways. Then I will hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sin and will heal their land. God does the changing. God changes things. So that's why we're calling this Lord Change Me. And God can change anything, you understand. God changed me from a tool and die maker at 20 years of age, filled with self-ambition, just new in the country, and my goal was to become a millionaire. And I had no interest in God, no interest in Jesus, no interest in the Bible. And 2 months after I met Jesus, I wanted to quit my job and study the Bible full time. And so I quit my job and went to Bible school. And that's how fast the changes began to happen in my life. And over the last 38 years now, I have loved Jesus more than life itself. God can change the most hopeless, darkest, most complex situation and turn it into the greatest blessing of your life. After all, God uses manure to fertilize roses. On Easter Sunday, He changed the darkest, most despairing and hopelessness of Good Friday into the most glorious, victorious day in the history of the world. God can change the most hopeless child, the most hopeless money problems, the most hopeless conflict, the most hopeless marriage, the most hopeless addictive bad habit. That's why the church is the place of hope. That's why I've said many times over the last 30 years when I've talked with someone who doesn't go to church and they are at a very dark, dismal, despairing, hopeless place, I always say to them, you need to come to church. Because the church is the place where you'll find some hope. You won't find hope anywhere else. Come to church and you'll find some hope. But God doesn't make all the change by Himself. God does what only He can do, and we do what He tells us to do. In other words, God supplies the power, the hope. He even supplies the tools. And He supplies the plan. And then He tells us what we need to do. So we have a part to play. And we've been looking at these 6 powerful, practical questions in the book of Nehemiah that produce change. Question 1 was this: what do you see? Nehemiah chapter 1, Nehemiah asked that question of some visitors who had come from Jerusalem, and he said, what do you see? when you look at the city of Jerusalem and when you look at the people of the city and they tell him, everything's broken. The walls are broken. The people are broken. And so the first question, when you look at your life, when you look at your job, when you look at your money, when you look at your family, when you look at your marriage, when you look in the mirror, what do you see in your orbit that's broken? What needs to change? What does God want to change? That's question one. Question two was, how do you feel? That talked about enthusiasm and passion, because you cannot change without passion. Nehemiah showed us that. Depression and discouragement stagnate change because they suffocate passion and enthusiasm, and they drain energy. Put another way, if you want to change, you've got to get the passion back. Then last week, we asked the third question that will change your life. Who do you trust? And that was all about prayer, because trust leads to prayer. And you cannot change spiritually without prayer. Nehemiah chapter 1, Nehemiah demonstrates that. The very first thing Nehemiah does is that he seeks God's face in prayer. And we saw over the last 2 weeks that as we went through that prayer, Nehemiah was saying, God, you're worthy and I am needy. And the more you understand God's worthiness, the more you understand your neediness. And we said last week that prayer is the most powerful, influential weapon in your arsenal. Prayer brings all the resources of heaven to bear on your life and your orbit. Somebody said, prayer is striking the winning blow. Everything else is merely picking up the pieces. Prayer is what enables you to seek the face of God. And it's when you come into God's presence, everything changes. John Piper said, God is most glorified when we are completely satisfied by His presence. So, first, you have to see what's broken and needs to change. Second, you have to have the passion and the enthusiasm and the emotional energy to want to change. And third, you need to be praying in God's presence before the throne of grace. So now we come to question 4. Now we're ready to get really, really practical. Here's question 4. What are you going to do? This step is all about coming up with a plan of action, or a POA, as my nephews in England would say. When I go to England, they'll say, so, Uncle Roy, what's the POA tonight? What's the plan of action? Anything that you make needs a plan. If you bake muffins, you need a plan, you need a recipe. If you build a house, you need a blueprint. If you're going on a trip, you need to map out a course. If you have a dream, you need a plan. A plan is simply a description of how to get there from here. If you are in financial chaos, you need a plan to get yourself organized. If you want to kick a bad habit, you need a plan. If you want to build a better relationship, you have to come up with a plan. So that begs the question, how do you come up with a good plan? Well, Nehemiah chapter 2 tells us exactly how to come up with a good plan. Look at verse 1. Chapter 2, Nehemiah, in the Old Testament, here's what it says. In the month of Nisan. Now that's not a car, you understand. That's a month. That's one of their calendar months. In the month of Nisan. Now that is the early spring. March, April. It's actually just right around now. And in chapter 1, verse 1, it tells us that this whole story started in the month of Chislev. That's November, December. So 4 months have passed between chapter 1 and chapter 2. Since Nehemiah first asked that question, what do you see? So this plan has been in incubation for 4 months. Now here's the first thing that we learn about plans, good plans. Good plans take time to design. You need time to do lots of thinking, lots of praying. Never make a long-term decision on the spot. Hastily laid plans usually unravel. That's why we talked a few weeks ago about not making plans and the decisions in the context of emotionalism, because they burn off and they never last. But when you take the time to pray and to think, the bigger the impact of a plan, generally, the longer it'll take to design the plan. So that's the first thing. Good plans take time to design. Now, let's go on. In the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and I gave it to the king. Now, I had not been sad in his presence, understood, before. You don't get sad in the presence of a king, because that would make the king miserable. When you come into the presence of a king, you come in with a smile on your face. Otherwise, you could lose your head. Very dangerous thing to come into the presence of a king in the old days with miserable look on your face. Verse 2. The king said to me, "Why is your face sad, seeing that you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart." Shows you how well the king knows Nehemiah. He's like a personal valet. The king knows Nehemiah well enough to know that Nehemiah is not sick. He's just miserable. Then it says, Nehemiah says, "I was very much afraid." Right, and so you should be. Verse 3. I said to the king, "Let the king live forever." He's letting him know he's loyal to the king, and he's asking the king to go easy on him. "Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves," he's talking about Jerusalem, "lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" And the king said to me, "What are you asking for? What are you requesting?" That is a great question. What do you want, Nehemiah? The city of Jerusalem is a mess. So what's your plan? What do you want to do? What are you requesting? Great question. Now look at Nehemiah's response. "So I prayed to the God of heaven." That's what you call an SOS prayer, an emergency prayer. The king has asked him a question, and before he answers the king, he talks to the King of Kings. He's practicing what James would say much later in the New Testament. In chapter 4, verse 15, James says, when you make plans, you ought to say, "If the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that." That's what James says. Nehemiah knows that his plans are in God's hands. And Nehemiah doesn't want to answer the king about what he wants until he has conferred one more time with the King of Kings. Here's the second thing we learn about a good plan. Good plans are birthed in prayer. Some people make plans and they never consult with God. The parable of the rich fool demonstrates that. Jesus said this guy had a bumper harvest one year. He had so much food that he didn't have barns big enough to house all the food. And this rich fool said, I know what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and I'll build bigger ones. And I'll have so much food stored that I'm just going to retire and put my feet up and I'm just going to live a life of luxury. And the fatal flaw in the story, as Jesus tells it, is it's all, I will, I will, I will, I will. And Jesus drops the bombshell when he says in the story, God said to him, you fool, tonight you're going to die. James talks about people just like that, who make plans as if they are God. And James says in chapter 4:14, you make all of these plans, yet you don't even know what tomorrow's going to bring. What is your life? Because you're a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Now, this is not intended to make you miserable. It's simply stating the reality is that you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. So, when you make your plans, you want to birth your plans in God's presence, in prayer, recognizing that He is the one who's sovereign. If you never pray, if you never spend time in His presence, if you never seek His face, the way we have just done this morning in worship, you cannot expect God to bless your plans. And then there are other people who make plans and they do talk to God about it, but they tell God what they're going to do after they've already decided what they're going to do, and they're simply asking God to bless what they're going to do. There was an old joke about one angel in heaven saying to another angel in heaven, hey, want to hear a joke? Here it is. Man's plans. That's the joke in heaven. Robbie Burns wrote a poem called To a Mouse. And in that little poem, To a Mouse, Robbie Burns writes, the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. Proverbs 19:21 says the same thing. Maybe this is where Robbie Burns got it from. Many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. Good plans are always birthed in prayer. This SOS prayer that Nehemiah prays is an example of how much Nehemiah believes in the importance and the priority and the power of prayer in the development of a plan. He's in the presence of the king, face to face with the king, and yet he seeks the face of the King of Kings. By the way, he also knows that prayer is the best filter to protect your mouth from getting you into trouble. Pray before you speak, or pray before you hit send. He prays here because he's been praying for the last 4 months. This is simply a continuation or an extension of a prayer life that has been seeking God's face for the last 4 months. He's not just making up this plan on the spot. He's not just saying, oh God, what do you want me to tell the king here? What plan do you want me to get? That's not what's happening. He's simply praying one more time, Lord, I've been putting this plan together for the last 4 months in your presence. Now I'm about to deliver it to the king. Please anoint my answer. You can't make plans and then ask God to bless them with a sort of a Tygon at the end prayer. We need to seek God's face and then make our plans. Good plans are birthed in prayer, incubated in prayer, that brings you into God's presence. Psalm 16 says, in His presence is fullness of joy and pleasure forevermore. When you are experiencing the joy and the pleasure and the peace of His presence, that's when you will make godly plans. God is most glorified when we are most satisfied by the joy and the pleasure of His presence. Yesterday morning, I came through that door behind Conrad there about 6 o'clock in the morning and came in here to pray. And the lights were off and it was very, very dark. I could hardly see a foot in front of me as I walked in there. And I walked along that aisle in the dark and I saw a shape in the pew 6 feet in front of me. And the shape was moving. And it was making noises. And in the dark, I just about had a stroke. And then I realized it was Pastor Kong, the Korean pastor of the church that meets here in the afternoons. And he tells me, like King Kong, Pastor Kong. And he was praying and moving and talking to God and seeking God's face out loud. And he didn't know that I was there. And so I quietly leaned forward and put my hand on his shoulder. He thought it was Satan. Does that every Saturday morning. For about an hour. For all the years that he's been here. Seeking God's face. God is glorified by my faithfulness to seek His face, not by the scope of my influence or the size of my ministry. God will look after the fruitfulness of my ministry. I am responsible for seeking His face and enjoying His presence. Good plans are birthed in His presence. Let's go on. Look at verse 5. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, so that I may rebuild it. Here's the third thing about a good plan. Good plans start at the end. When you're going to plan a task this size, there's an enormous amount of things that need to be planned and done. in order to accomplish it. And I'm going to show you a bunch of those details in a minute. But Nehemiah runs all the way to the end goal. And he's able to state it in like 3 seconds. Look at verse 5. I want to rebuild Jerusalem's walls. That took about 3 seconds to tell the king what he wanted to do. I want to rebuild the city. Man, if that had been me, I would have been saying, well, I got to do this, then I got to do that, then I got to do the other thing. And I would have been burying the king in details as thick as the phone book. But Nehemiah starts at the end. And he says, we're going to build a wall. Donald Trump would have loved Nehemiah. The king said, what are you requesting? What do you want? And Nehemiah says, build a wall. He answers by starting at the end. There's an old saying, if you don't know where you're going, you'll never know when you get there. Good plans start at the end. What is it that you want? Planning a road trip starts at the end. Where do you want to end up? Now let's reel it back and plan how you're going to get there. This is where you can dream. What do you want the end to look like? But a dream has to be realistic. An unrealistic dream is a fantasy that can very quickly turn into a nightmare. Somebody used to say to me, when Roy gets a vision, I get a nightmare. Dreams have to be realistic. Now, when you start at the end, you can break that down in a lot of different ways. For example, Nehemiah had a wall and a city to build, so he broke it down by time. The king said, how long is it going to take you? And he told them how long it was going to take. It's going to take this long. So when you start at the end, what do you want? You could break it down by time. For example, what do you want 12 months from now? Where do you want to be 5 years from now? Where do you want to be the day you retire? Here's a big one. What would you like to hear people say about you? Well, you're not going to hear them. What would you like people to say at your funeral about the kind of person you were? Break it down by time. Or you could break that question down by categories. For example, if you were in a marriage counseling office, you would be asking, what do you want your marriage to look like at the end? Or if you were in your accountant's office, you might ask, what do you want your wealth to look like at the end? Or if you were in a career class, you would be asking, what do you want your career to look like? Or your education to look like? Or if you were at the gym, you would be asking, what do you want in your health? What do you want your health to look like 5 years from now? Or if you were in a support group, you might be asking, what bad habit is it that you want to be free from? But since we're in a church, let's ask the question this way. What kind of person do you want to be at the end? What kind of spiritual person do you want to become? What kind of person does God want you to be? What kind of things would you hope that people will say at your funeral? How do you want to finish? Jesus spoke to 7 churches in the book of Revelation, and he gave each one of them an assessment of their condition. Imagine if Jesus was to give you an assessment of your condition. What would you hope that he might say to you at the end? Mary was just telling me that 7 years ago today, George went home to glory. George finished so well. Was ready for heaven for decades. Couldn't wait to get home to heaven. Finished beautifully. Vera Morgan just passed into the Lord's presence a few months ago. Same thing. She, in the last few weeks, had told me, I can't wait to get into heaven. Grace tells me routinely, I can't wait to meet Jesus face to face. Wow, what a way to finish. Incidentally, Barry Morgan was telling me last week that he's been using his mom's cell phone the last couple of days. And the other night, my cell phone was sitting on our dining room table and Angela was sitting beside it, and it rang. It was Barry calling on his mom's phone. And Angela picked up my phone and saw Vera Morgan show up, and she thought his mom was calling, and she dropped my phone as if there was a cockroach on it. She thought it was Vera calling. Kind of legacy do you want to pass on to your kids? What kind of influence do you want your kids to benefit from after you're gone? When I got saved in November 1980, I discovered very early on that God wanted me to live my life to please Him. Very simple. 2 Corinthians 5:9 says that. More than anything else, we want to please Him. Galatians 1:10 says the same thing. Then you will be able to live as the Lord wants and will always do what pleases Him. 1 Corinthians 2:4 says the same thing. We always speak as God wants us to speak because God has judged us worthy to be entrusted with the good news. We do not try to please people. We want to please God who tests our motives. 1 John 2:17 says the same thing. It says that pleasing Him is the only thing that is going to last. The world and everything else that people desire is passing away. But those who do the will of God, in other words, those who please God, live forever. I love the smell of a nice scent. Our Jocelyn uses these fancy aromatic scents in her little massage therapy room at the back of our house. I love is it lemongrass? I love the lemongrass one. I love the smell of a nice scent. So does God. Listen to Philippians 4:18. Epaphroditus has brought me all of your gifts. They are like a sweet-smelling offering to God, a sacrifice which is acceptable and pleasing to Him. That's the way I want to finish. Sweet-smelling offering. Acceptable, pleasing to Him. I mean, who would want to finish smelling like a dead rodent? That's what I want in my epitaph. He tried to please Christ. So how do you want to finish? In the epilogue of a book called The Deeper Life, Satisfying the 8 Vital Longings of the Soul, there's a reading called The Little Old Man. The author is unknown, but the insights will challenge you. And I'll close with this. You're going to meet an old man someday. Speaking to the men, of course. Ladies, you'll have to translate that, little old lady. You're going to meet a little old man down the road 10, 30, 50 years from now, waiting there for you. You're going to be catching up with him. What kind of old man is it that you're going to meet? Well, that's a rather significant question. He may be a seasoned, soft, gracious fellow, a gentleman who has grown old gracefully, surrounded by hosts of friends, friends who call him blessed because of what his life has meant to them. Or he may be a bitter, disillusioned, dried-up old buzzard without a good word for anybody, soured, friendless, and alone. The kind of old man you will meet depends entirely on you, because that old man is going to be you. He's going to be the composite of everything that you're doing, saying, and thinking right now, today and tomorrow. His mind is going to be set in a mold that you have made by your beliefs. His heart is going to be turning out what you have been putting into it. Every little thought, every deed goes into this old man. He's going to be exactly what you make of him. It's up to you. You'll have no one else to credit or to blame. Every day and in every way, you are becoming more and more like yourself. Amazing, but it's true. You're beginning to look more like yourself, think more like yourself, talk more like yourself. You're becoming more and more yourself. Live only in terms of what you're getting out of life, and the old man is going to get smaller, drier, harder, crabbier, and more self-centered. But open your life to others. Think in terms of what you can give, your contribution to life, and the old man will grow larger and softer and kindlier and greater. The point to remember is that these things don't always show up immediately, but they will show up sooner than you think. Those little things that seem so unimportant right now, those beliefs and attitudes and ambitions, they're adding up inside of you where you can see them, crystallizing your heart and your mind. And someday they're going to harden into that old man, and nothing is going to be able to soften or change them. The time to take care of that old man is right now, today, this week. Examine his values, his motives, and his attitudes. Check up on him. Work him over while he's still plastic, still in a formative condition, because the day is going to come awfully soon when it's too late. The hardness sets in worse than paralysis. Character crystallizes, sets, and gels. And that's the finish. Any wise businessman takes inventory regularly, but his merchandise is nowhere near as important as he is. Better take a bit of personal inventory. We all need it. And by keeping this check on ourselves, you'll be much more likely to meet a splendid old fellow at the proper time. A fellow you would like to be. Every day and in every way, you are becoming more and more like yourself. Amazing, but it's true. End quote. A good plan always starts at the end. Nehemiah says, I want to rebuild the walls. So how do you want to finish? And what do you need to do every single day in order to finish well? That's what we'll talk about next week in part 2 of this 4th question. Let's bow our heads and pray. And our time is gone, but I'm going to ask you to pray for just a moment in your heart, or you can pray out loud if you want. I'm just going to suggest a line for you. Lord, thank you that you are, and finish that sentence. And then pray this: help me to make a plan to change my fill in the blank. Okay, I'll give you that one more time. Lord, thank you that you are. And then help me to make a plan to change my, and fill in the blank. Let's just take a few seconds to pray that. And if you want to pray that aloud, feel free. And then I'm just going to close. I'll give you it one more time. Lord, thank you that you are. Help me to make a plan to change my. Lord, thank you that you love me, that you wrote this book to show me how to live. And you're so powerful that nothing is impossible. Nothing is unchangeable. Help me, Lord, to make a plan to change. Struggle with discouragement. Help me to experience the joy and the pleasure of your presence. Lord, this week when I go to Nicaragua, help me to please you in my words and my actions, with my colleagues, and with the folks of Nicaragua that you will give me the privilege of interacting with. In Jesus' name we pray.